Dear guests of MGIMO University, dear students, dear professors, dear speakers and moderators, I'm Andrey BAYKOV. I'm Vice Rector of this university in charge of international graduate programs. And this is the second MGIMO-Fletcher conference on Russian-US relations. This conference has been co-sponsored by our two institutions and also generously supported financially by the Carnegie Corporation on the Fletcher side and by the Art, Science and Sport Foundation on the MGIMO side. As this is the second conference, I think it would be important for me to give an insight into how the November conference went. The November conference, in a sense, was very similar to this one in the breadth of topics covered. It was also very varied and basically covered everything from hard security to soft security perceptions and all other things that are going to be covered here as well today, but with a different accent, with a different emphasis, different academic focus. Back then in November, since we're just about to start our cooperation, we mostly focused on the areas of disagreements. So we're trying to work out the actual differences where both countries take different stands. The focus of this conference is going to be somewhat different, even though the areas that we're going to cover are going to be the same. It will be on where we can actually cooperate, what are the prospects for collaboration, and how can we advance and promote interaction to serve both countries and the international community's interests. This conference is taking place as part of a larger framework of cooperation between MGIMO and the Fletcher School, which officially started just 1 year ago, or slightly over 1 year. But in fact, we've been collaborating for some time, mostly through joint video conference courses that have been running for several years. Professor Robert Legwold was teaching them while staying here and then also going back to the Fletcher. Now, as part of this cooperation, which was inaugurated by the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding, we have the student and professor mobility. This is the second conference, and we are hoping to institutionalize something more formal in the shape of a joint program as well. Now, as you've seen the program, my co-convener, Professor Dan Drezner, and I have really set a very ambitious agenda for all of us. This conference is going to last for the entire day, literally, and it's going to finish at 20:45 if we are on time. So it's a real test on our intellectual perseverance and stamina, but those who survive will be rewarded, as I hope, not just by the value added intellectually, but also by a standing champagne reception after the last panel finishes. Since we have 7 panels, if I'm not mistaken, and quite a few speakers, I think that discipline and self-discipline is the key to success of this conference. So when you see in the description of the conference format that it is 5 to 7 minutes, 7 minutes is the absolute maximum. It's meant just to kick off the discussion and then to open up the floor for questions and comments so that we could engage in a proper discussion, not just speak past one another, as very often happens in such meetings. Several remarks on the composition of speakers. The idea for the November conference was that the MGIMO side, or the Russian side rather, was represented by the MGIMO faculty, whereas the Fletcher was inviting more broadly from across the United States and even Europe. The same logic applies to this conference, that the American side is represented just by the Fletcher faculty, whereas we have tried to invite people from other institutions and think tanks. These are truly leading experts from their field, and mostly from our institute, from the Russian Academy of Sciences, as well from the leading think tanks that are based here in Moscow. So this will be a real discussion reflecting different points of view that exist here in town. We have invited students. You can see some students here. There will be more coming in and out because it's a standard class day, but also there are exams going on, consultations, and residual classes still about to finish up. So please bear with the constant movement that is going to take place. And by the way, if you don't want to disturb the proceedings of the conference, there is another way through the upper level of this conference room, just through the back flight of stairs. Thus, keeping to my own rule of discipline and self-discipline, I'm going to now stop here and give the floor for the welcoming remark to Georgy BORISENKO, who is the Director of the Department of North America at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. Thank you very much.
Dear friends, we are lucky to have simultaneous translation. That's why I will speak Russian, because it will be strange if I should be translated from English into Russian. Прежде всего, хотел бы поблагодарить за приглашение.
First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this conference dedicated to the current state of relations between Russia and the U.S. It's very characteristic that the two main diplomacy schools in Russia and the U.S. respectively, MGIMO and the Fletcher School, these regular conferences are becoming a good tradition, and they draw extensive interest in both countries. The agenda for today's conference is very extensive, very comprehensive, and basically includes the entire spectrum of issues and topics of relations between our two countries, starting from security to culture and economy. It is very characteristic that the participants of this conference are putting their main focus of attention on looking for ways and areas of cooperation between our two countries, and such a brainstorm involving reputed political scientists and experts is highly needed today. Today we have with us in this room people who follow closely the U.S.-Russian relations and their dynamics today, so I won't go into the detail of the latest developments in our bilateral relationship, but I'll only say that we are disappointed with the level of relations between our two countries. Russia is still interested in good relations with the U.S., but practical interaction is intoxicated, is poisoned by a wave of Russophobia, which has washed over a significant part of the Washington political establishment. A sad reflection of this was the shutting down by the U.S. government of both general consulates of Russia on the west coast of the United States. Sanctions are being imposed on Russia, and it even goes up to absurd, because even a Moscow swimming pool called Chaika, Seagull, located next to this university's old building, it's been blacklisted, included in a sanction list. We don't know why. Maybe it's because it's located to a bridge which is called the Crimea Bridge. Russia has been officially fingered as an adversary to the U.S. in the latest global strategy, and this was later reiterated in national strategy documents, national defense documents, and nuclear policy documents recently adopted in the U.S. Their tone is very confrontational towards Russia, and we are forced to respond in kind to such unfriendly steps. In particular, recently we had to respond in kind to 60 Russian diplomats being deported, being expelled from the U.S., and respond in kind, and we intend to do so in the future in accordance with international rules. But we would like to point out that we don't want to do it. We just have to do it because those are the rules, and we are still open to a constructive dialogue on the widest possible range of issues with the U.S. And the Russian president spoke to that end on many occasions. We are convinced that it is in the interests of both our countries to build a predictable model of interaction between our two countries based on mutual respect and non-interference into each other's affairs. It is also characteristic that President Trump has been speaking pretty much in the same spirit. And on several occasions, in bilateral direct contacts with Russia, he stressed his intention to bring our bilateral relations back on track. But so far, we don't see that put into practice. Vice versa, we see our relations deteriorate further. We have to state that our potential for cooperation is not being used to full advantage in areas such as combating terrorism, drug trafficking, settling regional conflicts. Meanwhile, a joint effort by our two countries in all of those those areas would be most welcome and necessary. We should remember about the special responsibility that the US and Russia bear as the two main nuclear powers, the world's two strongest nuclear powers, and warranters of global stability. Given a constructive approach, we could actually earn some positive results even in the present situation. And we can see testimony to that in what businesses do, because even in a situation of sanctions imposed by Washington, businesses still find opportunities for constructive cooperation in trade. Last year, our mutual trade grew by 16%. A large U.S. business delegation that is now at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. It is the largest foreign delegation there. The forum launches today, and according to its accreditation data, there are a lot of people from the U.S., business people from the U.S., so they're showing a lot of interest. And their counterparts in Russia are happy to welcome them. They're trying to provide favorable conditions for them, but of course they're hoping for reciprocity, because we believe that it would be also important to promote people-to-people contacts, because one of the main issues and challenges of our bilateral relations today is a deficit of confidence, a lack of confidence, and it comes from a lack of mutual understanding. So we need to promote personal exchange, people-to-people exchange, because it helps to overcome these personal mental barriers. And the more contacts we have, society to society, academia to academia, the fewer reasons for mistrust and suspicion we'll have. And that would probably also facilitate intergovernmental dialogue and make it more positive. And essentially, that is the essential purpose of this dialogue and the regular conferences between MGIMO and the Fletcher School. And I would like to thank both co-organizers, co-sponsors for this very helpful initiative. Despite all the issues between Moscow and Washington today, there is still a lot of opportunities for cooperation. But to stabilize our relationship, we have to build our dialogue on mutual respect and mutual and equality, and respect for mutual interests that both parties have. We also need to finally give up these useless attempts and efforts to apply pressure, political and even military pressure on Russia to extort unilateral concessions from it, because such efforts only take us further into a dead end in our relationship. And this discussion on how to get to a better stage have a very serious practical value. So I would like to wish success to this conference and its participants, and also fruitful work in the future. Thank you.
Спасибо, Georgy Evgenich.
Thank you very much, Mr. Borisenko. And now,
of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and Professor of International Economics there.
Thank you, Andrey. I had initially thought to begin my remarks with a formal list of honored guests who were here. But after just 3 days in Moscow, I feel comfortable in simply saying, dear friends, it's my privilege to represent the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in welcoming everybody to today's conference. The Dean of the Fletcher School, Admiral James Stavridis, sends his warmest regards to our colleagues at MGIMO, along with his regrets at not being able to attend the conference in person. The Fletcher School has already benefited greatly from its partnership with MGIMO. Our two schools share a mission to deepen international understanding and to train experts in international relations and diplomacy. The timing of our collaboration could not be better. Admiral Stavridis often says that U.S. policy towards Russia should be to confront when necessary and to cooperate where possible. And that dichotomy very nicely frames the two MGIMO-Fletcher conferences that we're having this year. The first, as Andrey said, on areas of disagreement. The second, on areas of cooperation. I am not an expert in U.S.-Russian relations, but it doesn't take an expert to know that these are challenging times for our relationship. In recent years, Russian-American relations have deteriorated dramatically, with tensions arising across multiple domains. The first MGIMO-Fletcher Joint Conference on U.S.-Russian relations, held at the Fletcher School this past November, highlighted areas of disagreement between our two countries The topics addressed in that conference included differences over legal principles of territorial integrity, differences over cybersecurity, differences over regional conflicts in the Middle East, Ukraine, and the Korean Peninsula, differences over the role of NATO and the Euro-Atlantic Order, differences over international economic relations. It was a long list, and given this long list of differences, it's a good thing we're having a second conference. Today, we turn to areas of U.S.-Russian cooperation. Participants in today's conference will explore our shared interests and the many ways in which U.S.-Russian collaboration can help to advance our common goals. Today's discussions will address our shared goals with regard to nuclear non-proliferation, counterterrorism and non-state threats, the use of international law as a tool of cooperation, management and governance of common spaces, both physical and virtual, along with religious differences in cultural exchange as tools of diplomacy, and economic relations as well. It's a good thing we have all day to talk about this. But even if after 12 hours we don't succeed in resolving all of these pressing and complicated issues, one thing I know that we will accomplish will be to deepen the ties between MGIMO and the Fletcher School. I believe that international cooperation begins with international understanding, and what better way for us here to contribute to that understanding than for MGIMO and the Fletcher School to collaborate in as many ways as possible in training the future diplomats of our two countries. Our co-training began with a single course that connected MGIMO and Fletcher students via a live video link into a single classroom where future Russian and American diplomats could meet one another, exchange ideas, collaborate on projects. We now offer 2 such classes, and I look forward to further deepening the ties between MGIMO and the Fletcher School. I know it will be to the mutual benefit of both of our schools, and I hope it ultimately contributes as well to strengthening the ties between our two countries. So on behalf of my colleagues at the Fletcher School, I want to thank Rector Turkonov and his colleagues, especially Andrey BAYKOV, for being such generous and welcoming hosts, and the Carnegie Corporation for its generous sponsorship, and best wishes to all of us for a stimulating and productive conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And now, last but not least, Minister Counsel of Public Affairs of the Embassy of the United States, Mr. Thomas Leary. Please, the floor is yours.
Good morning. I'm honored to be with you here today at the opening of this MGIMO-Fletcher Conference on Russian-American relations. Obviously, the U.S.-Russian political relationship is going through a difficult period. There is a lack of trust between our countries and much that we do not agree upon. Ukraine, Syria, and the principle of non-interference in our internal affairs that my colleague Georgy BORISENKO referred to. Nevertheless, it is abundantly clear to us that the only way forward is to find opportunities for discussion and dialogue. We won't always agree, but we need to keep the lines of communication open and discuss our differences. And we need to find ways to work together in those areas where we have common interests. Trade is one such area where our interests coincide. The connections created through economic engagement are key to a better relationship. Today, Ambassador Huntsman is at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, along with 20 senior executives from American companies doing business here. Sanctions, obviously, get the most attention, but they represent just part of the story of our economic relationship. Russian entrepreneurs are finding ways to grow their ideas in the United States, and American businesses are eager to gain access to the Russian market. And these businesses have a lot to offer. U.S. businesses working in Russia hire Russians to work in their enterprises. They train these employees and invest in them, creating human capital that is beneficial to both our countries. The people-to-people relationships created through business ties provide the ballast that will keep U.S.-Russian relations on an even keel over the long term. Connections between Russian and American universities and cultural institutions also sustain our broader relations in periods of policy differences. Senator J. William Fulbright, who was responsible for the United States government's flagship educational exchange program, aptly described the value of educational exchange in this way. Educational exchange is not merely one of those nice but marginal activities in which we engage in international affairs, but rather, from the standpoint of future world peace and order, probably the most important and potentially rewarding of our foreign policy activities. Promoting mutual understanding through educational and cultural exchange is vitally important to both our countries. Important in and of itself, and important in its capacity to sustain the broader relationship in periods of tension. We need to put our current differences into proper perspective. We have been wartime allies, Cold War adversaries, and many things in between. The one constant in the U.S.-Russian relationship has been and continues to be the ties that link our peoples, sometimes with the involvement of our governments, but more often without it. The issues that you will discuss at today's conference include some of the most salient in U.S.-Russian relations: nonproliferation, counterterrorism, and the management of common spaces, including cyberspace. Finding common ground between our countries in these and other areas isn't easy, but it is essential to our well-being. I hope that your discussions are productive and that the ties between these two great schools dedicated to the study of international relations endure and prosper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Leary. So this is the end of our welcome session, and please mind that we move into the first panel without any break. So I thank all those present at the welcoming session and presenting their welcome remarks to the students and participants.
Dear colleagues, dear American guests, Russian participants, on behalf of the organizer of the session, Non-Proliferation of Weapons of Mass Destruction, I would like to send my deepest gratitude to the organizers of this conference, and would like to say that our session will be devoted to one of the most important and pressing issues of international politics, international agenda, political agenda, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, including several important points such as the problem of NPT Treaty, Non-Proliferation Treaty, the problems of nuclear proliferation in certain regions of the world, like the problems of nuclear disarmament and nuclear program of North Korea, the problem of nuclear deal, Iranian nuclear deal, and also the problems of general prohibition of nuclear weapons, and the problem of the treaty on this prohibition. I would like to say that the new Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed in 1970, still remains the only reliable and the only acting mechanism for curbing nuclear proliferation. And when it was signed in 1970, it was estimated that in some 20 or 25 years there would be not less than 20 or 30 states possessing nuclear weapons. But still, after 40 years after its signature, only 5 members of the United Nations possess nuclear weapons, which were not, which did not join the treaty. Therefore, one of the problems that should be discussed is how the regime of Non-Proliferation Treaty could be strengthened, how it could be continued in the perspective, and what are the problems dealing with this Non-Proliferation Treaty. Another aspect of today's discussion is the is the nuclear issue of North Korea. The coming meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un attracts international attention, and what could be the implications of that meeting over the problem of nuclear proliferation on the Korean Peninsula. And the last thing I would like to dwell upon is the Iranian nuclear deal. We know that on May the 8th, President Trump announced the withdrawal of the United States from the nuclear deal with Iran. And how do participants of today's conference assess the implications of this decision, and what will be the long-term consequences of this unexpected development for the whole NPT regime? Today we have three main speakers, and I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Evgeny Buzinsky, Chairman of the Executive Board of PIR Center. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, before I start, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for invitation. And I would also like to repeat that in a couple of months, the treaty on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons will mark the 50th anniversary since its opening for signature. For 5 decades, the NPT has played a critical role in establishing and cementing the international legal architecture of disarmament and non-proliferation, which has allowed to effectively prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons for many years. To be honest, the current state of non-proliferation regime and international situation in general is challenging. The threat of armed conflicts in different regions of the world, even with the involvement of nuclear weapons, is growing. Let me dwell upon 3 major issues which may seriously undermine the NPT and the process of non-proliferation in general. First is the situation with the Joint Comprehensive Plan for Action, JCPOA, on the Iran's nuclear program, concluded 3 years ago, in 2015. The agreement reached between EU+3 and Iran through the EU mediation is a unique combination of measures developed within the existing framework of the time-tested UN Security Council and IAEA mechanisms and additional voluntary steps of the states parties to the deal. As a result, the JCPOA gives full confidence in the exclusively peaceful nature of the Iran's nuclear program while ensuring its inherent right to the development of a civil nuclear program. The Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement and the additional protocol implemented by Iran provide the agency with a timeless possibility to monitor, verify, and confirm the absence in Iran of any undeclared nuclear material or activity. The IAEA on a regular basis confirms Iran's full compliance with the relevant obligations. The JCPOA is quite a fragile compromise. Any deviation from its general philosophy or breach of non-compliance with its provisions, as well as any attempts to amend its text for someone's benefit, will inevitably affect the global non-proliferation regime and have powerful negative consequences for regional and global stability and security. In this context, the 12 conditions for the U.S. adherence to the JCPOA put forward by Secretary Pompeo a few days ago are absolutely unrealistic and unacceptable for any country with a minimum feeling of self-respect. Signatories to the agreement, except the United States, strongly insist that continuing faithful and comprehensive implementation of the JCPOA and the UN Security Council Resolution 2231 by all states parties to the nuclear deal without exceptions meet the interests of the entire global community. Second problem, the situation with the DPRK's nuclear program. The developments around JCPOA will directly influence any outcome of the efforts to settle the nuclear problem of the North Korean peninsula through diplomatic means. The breach of the JCPOA without any reason and against the will of the international community would hardly add to the confidence of the DPRK that any potential future agreements would be observed. The international community welcomed with cautious optimism the recent positive developments on the Korean Peninsula, including a number of highest-level contacts with the participation of Pyongyang and recent declarations by DPRK on suspension of nuclear tests and test launches of the intercontinental ballistic missiles. Russia never recognized the DPRK's ambitions to acquire a nuclear status. Moscow considers unacceptable any DPRK in compliance with the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. However, Russia cannot turn a blind eye to the obvious. The denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is possible only with reaching a complex solution to all security issues in Northeast Asia, including the growing problem of building up the US missile defense system capabilities. Some time ago, Russia and China put forward a joint initiative with a step-by-step moving plan towards this goal. I believe that in the current circumstances, the elements of these initiatives are relevant and worth considering. Third, the situation with arms control in general and nuclear arms control in particular. Russia is convinced that international community efforts in the area of nuclear disarmament should be focused at this stage on creation of prerequisites for further steps in this sphere. Again and again stresses the need to engage all the states possessing military nuclear capabilities in the work to reduce and limit nuclear weapons. Russia calls on all the members of the international community to be proactive in solving the relevant problems of international security and stability. Among them are an unrestricted deployment of global missile defense systems, development of non-nuclear high-precision strategic offensive weapons, a prospect of placing strike weapons in outer space, and growing quality and quantity imbalances in the sphere of conventional arms. As these issues are not being settled, it destroys trust between states, destabilizes disarmament architecture, and is becoming a more and more serious obstacle on the way of promoting disarmament efforts. In this context, I would like to draw special attention to the decision taken by Washington to renounce the policy of supporting the ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, and create conditions to resume nuclear tests. These actions by the US represent a serious blow to the CTBT and create an extremely worrying situation in the area of nuclear non-proliferation. It should be understood that if the example of Washington could be followed by other states which ratification is required for the CTBT entry into force, that will pave the way for an unrestricted nuclear arms race. And one more issue that may lead to the dismantlement of the whole structure of the US-Russia nuclear arms control structure. I mean the situation with the INF Treaty. Recently, at the very highest level, Russia reaffirmed its commitment to its provisions. Moscow shares the concern voiced by a number of states regarding the future of the treaty. The United States continues to reproduce its unsubstantiated allegations. While the fact that the US has been severely violating for many years the INF Treaty and trying to justify its intention to destroy it by shifting responsibility on Russia is being silenced. I do believe that chances to save the INF Treaty are still there, and the US will be strong enough to show political will needed. I am confident that strengthening the global nuclear non-proliferation regime is only possible if three key elements of the treaty are implemented in a balanced manner: nuclear non-proliferation, peaceful use of nuclear energy, and nuclear disarmament. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your brief and very highly focused presentation. I think that we should discuss the problems of proliferation, the problems of banning nuclear tests, and the problems of control later. And I would like to pass the floor to Professor Diana Chigas, Professor of Practice of International Negotiation and Conflict Resolution. Thank you very much, Diana. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers, and especially Andrey, who I know has been working very hard. And as you heard, I'm not an expert on nonproliferation. My area is negotiations, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the negotiation dilemmas inherent in this field. 3 years ago, I facilitated a meeting among the U.S. Negotiators and former special representatives to North Korea and some experts to examine the theories of change underlying the strategies and see if there could bridge gaps and develop a more evidence-based strategy going forward. And I just note that there was a handful of people there. And given the importance of the issue to the United States, it's astounding how few people actually focus on this issue on an ongoing basis. And at the time, the White House and State Department had 1 or 2 people and weren't even meeting with the experts. It was completely ignoring the issue. 3 years later, we've seen the fire and fury speech by President Trump, a number of articles in mainstream foreign policy publications advocating for a military solution. It's time to bomb North Korea and talk of a bloody nose attack, which a little scary. And at the same time, an historic meeting of the 2 Korean leaders, now coming up on a summit between Kim Jong-un and Trump, which may be postponed, we'll see. And the U.S. disengaging from Iran. So a question is, how do you make sense of this in terms of a U.S. negotiating strategy? Is there a strategy there? And are we going to have, is this a repeat of previous sort of near breakthroughs and sort of confusion, or are we headed towards something positive? And so I'd say on the positive end, there are a number of things have changed that have moved things forward. North Korea declared a nuclear state. While it may not totally be true, questions about, there are questions about the reliability of delivery systems. They are on the cusp. And they can afford to take a pause, but that it's also made the issue more urgent for the United States and focused some attention, which is good. North Korea has been making efforts to modernize the economy even before this has happened, so the interest in the economy has sort of grown and deepened. Relationship with China has shifted between North Korea, and again, while China would still like to see a buffer with the U.S.-supported South Korea, also worried about the North's behavior. So a lot of things have come together and created conditions for sanctions to work, international alignment to happen, and to bring North Korea at least to the table. And I have to say, although as a negotiation expert I would not agree with fire and fury, the credibility and predictability of Donald Trump and the fire and fury and threat of military pressure has created a credible threat, which hadn't been sort of credible before, and has brought people to the table. So the U.S. stated strategy is one of maximum pressure and maximum engagement, and people who talk about it say the "and" is important because they both have to work together. The pressure is not going to work without the engagement, and sort of it, to some extent, in both North Korea and Iran, it's worked. Tighter sanctions, starting with the Obama administration, worked to help bring about the situation we see today, both in North Korea and Iran. And in North Korea, I think it's the first time we've actually seen a strategy of pressure and a strategy of engagement coming together. Usually it's one or the other. And we have a history of failed efforts. So something new is good. So on the other side, there are some reasons to be concerned that this is not going to work, and it's going to create the conditions for future proliferation. And I'd emphasize first the ambiguity and sort of unclear goals on the U.S. side, which has been a constant since before the 1994 agreement with North Korea. There's lack of clarity of what this negotiation should be about. And so the focus on denuclearization, and I would agree that it is an unrealistic goal, but even the focus on denuclearization or prevention of nuclear capabilities effectively deprioritizes other policy issues, human rights, illicit activities, other military developments, other than nuclear weapons, countries' behavior in the region, and there is disagreement within the United States about which ones should be a priority and what should be emphasized. And so there's disagreement about what the goals of a negotiation ought to be. There are multiple interests, and you can't meet them all at the same time. So pursuing some will undermine the others. And effectively, given the relationship of extreme distrust, if one wants to tackle proliferation and the nuclear issue, you have to separate it from the other issues. But if you separate it of the other issues, those concerned with the other issues say our issues are going to be then relegated to not being able to be addressed. And so I think that's the dilemma. And in North Korea, this has plagued negotiations for decades now and has made it difficult for the U.S. to have a coherent and consistent policy. And I think in Iran, partly, this explains the rejection and withdrawal from the JCPOA. Not only, but partly. Trump and those in the Trump administration have a different assessment about what the priorities want to be and are unwilling to separate those out from some of the other issues related to Iran, which Obama, of course, recognized, but said, okay, let's start with this first. And so I just sent a couple more points. The willingness to actually move forward on the nuclear issue, let's say in Iran, partly depends on whether you think an incremental strategy is feasible or effective. And so I think Obama quite explicitly said, we'll start with this because this is what we can get and it's an important issue, and use this as a stepping stone to improve relations so that we can develop the capacity to address the other issues. And I think many in the Trump administrations don't believe that's possible. That an incremental strategy won't work, and we're just postponing issues and never will address them, and so giving something up now in order not to get something later because they won't change. And so I think there's a fundamental sort of attitude difference that partly, again, not fully explains some of this. So finally, I'd look at, so getting to an agreement on the nuclear issue, I think means you need to prioritize, and we're having a hard time prioritizing. And the consequences, I think, are some of the things that we're seeing now that is going to make the North Korea deal very difficult. One is what are, I think many people have called unreasonable demands, both with North Korea and with Iran. And that creates no zone, I mean, there's no zone of agreement as it is. We've stuck in our positions. I believe, and I think there are many in the United States who also believe denuclearization is unlikely to happen. There are increasing calls for a strategy of containment and shifting that. That's been happening for a number of years now. And that debate, again, still is continuing in that sort of disagreement about the goals. But it's clear that North Korea and the U.S. have very different interpretations of what denuclearization means. And the current circumstances make it hard to believe that North Korea will ever give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for something that's uncertain and potentially retractable benefits in the future. And Iran, I think the behavior of it feels to Iran and to North Korea as getting a message that the U.S. is moving the goalposts and increasing the demands. And so that makes the negotiation very difficult. Also has led to incompatible messages. What is the signal that these various things are sending? And I think the signaling will increase distrust, which will make then the agreement difficult to achieve, despite some quite dramatic breakthroughs. I mean, having Trump agree to a summit with Kim Jong-un was a real rejection of decades and decades of U.S. policy and U.S. thinking that sort of even talking to the enemy is a concession. So pulling out of the Iran deal, so while we have a maximum engagement in the summit is a big North Korea is hearing the possibility with the reference to Libya, with the withdrawal from the Iran deal of regime change, of the possibility of reneging on a deal later, and then, of course, looking at the verification regimes and looking that we're rejecting a quite intrusive verification regime in Iran, which would have to be deeper if it were with a nuclear state. They're saying, so what's going to happen now? So I think it's making some of the will make some of the negotiation dynamics more difficult, and will then undermine trust. Because I think trust in this environment of distrust, and I'd say not even mistrust, it's distrust, because I think both sides feel betrayed by the previous deals, so it makes it more difficult. The ability trust building and the ability to do agreements on a transactional basis in this atmosphere of distrust actually requires a lot of consistency and predictability. And that's part of what's now missing in the situation, so it will make it difficult. And I'll say just one last thing about does the U.S. want a deal? I mean, it's very much a take-it-or-leave-it strategy. And I think a question is that in many people's mind, is this a tactic and a strategy, or is it something that the U.S. really believes? And Trump has adopted a very standard distributive negotiating style. Take it or leave it, put maximum pressure and high demands, and hope that you can pressure the other side into conceding. And I think a question would be, in this administration, I don't have an answer, have they estimated how the other side will react to that and what they feel like their alternatives and what their line is. But I believe that Trump, at least, is using this as a negotiating strategy and not as a serious sort of underlying substantive strategy.
Thank you very much, Diana. I think Diana raised very important, very I would like pressing issues in her presentation. One of them is the problem of so-called transactional approach to nuclear disarmament, and namely speaking to the problem of nuclear deal with Iran and with North Korea. Whether this approach, namely speaking the so-called bilateral deals with Iran and with North Korea could work, whether they are sustainable, especially towards North Korea, and how could we assess the historical experience of these deals, because these deals are not new and there are some points that could be derived from historical experience. Another thing is the so-called the problem of comprehensive approach to such deals. We could rely on incremental strategy, step by step, or should we, so to say, associate such deals with broader issues, the broader issues of human rights, the broader issues of regime change, or the stability on regional stability, or should they be focused only on some technical problems of nuclear deals concerning the problem of the control, the problem of NPT regime, etc. These are the, so to say, existential problems of NPT regime and non-proliferation regime, generally speaking, and that these are the things that should be discussed later. And with pleasure, I would like to pass the floor to Professor Alexander Nikitin, Professor of Political Theory at MGIMO University. Thank you.
Thank you. The theme of this session is quite wide, and in 7 minutes I decided to respond to two questions which are placed by organizers. I quote from the program: how do Russia and the United States assess threats? To what extent do their assessments overlap or diverge? And to respond to this, I'm using the results of our fresh study, which we did here at MGIMO at the Center for Euro-Atlantic Security. We used the well-known methodology of the classical content analysis, the computerized content analysis. We used a German-based software, and we analyzed about 20 documents, doctrinal documents, 5 documents of the United States, including the several editions of the National Security Strategy and the latest Nuclear Posture Review, then 3 documents of NATO, strategic concepts of NATO of different years, and a group of documents of European Union, and finally editions, 3 editions of the Russian military doctrine and 3 editions of the Russian foreign policy concept. First of all, we were trying to look what type of notions and language is used and which is not used, which is also important. For example, one of the findings is this, that in none of American strategic documents you can find the words or notions of rules of international relations, rules of behavior on the international arena, world order, multipolarity. All this is absolutely absent from all American doctrinal documents. Soft power is used very limitedly, and what's interesting is the terminology of strategic stability is practically not used in the American doctrinal documents. Then what are the some key notions which you can find there? First of all, the notion of values. But as you see from this first graph, there is some dynamics. Values were much more important in the times of more liberal-oriented democratic administrations, and with arrival of Trump administration, the documents of 2017 and 2018 bring the use of notion of values, democratic values, international values. We tried different combinations of notions, is less and less applicable. Then the use of references to the United Nations. Again, we see the same dynamics. United Nations were much more important for the previous democratic administration and much, much less important during the period when Trump administration arrived to White House. The same is reconfirmed by using the terminology of United Nations supported peace operations, peacekeeping, conflict resolution. Just a second. At the same time, the use of notion of deterrence is growing and growing in importance, and the deterrence is used not only in the meaning of nuclear deterrence. Deterrence is also used in the meaning of containment, political containment of Russia, of Iran, of North Korea, and this is different with the Russian documents where the terminology of deterrence is used only in a pure notion, pure sense of the nuclear deterrence. Here is the tendency of the application of the notion of peacekeeping. As I said, it shows the same tendency that the much more pragmatic approach, much more realist-oriented, not the liberal-oriented approach of the recent administration. If we analyze the documents of the European Union, we see exactly the opposite tendency. The beginning of the 90s, 92, the early documents like Maastricht Treaty, they were not based upon the notion of values. It was a period when the European Union was more very pragmatically trying to manage countries who were not sure that they want to compose one identity. But with years, the use of values as motivation for international relations actions increased very visibly and very dramatically. The same happens with the application of United Nations in the mentality of the European Union. European Union, again, is showing absolutely opposite tendency towards the American doctrinal documents. Growing and growing and growing of application references to the United Nations. If we take Russian doctrinal documents, we would see that statistically the scale of the graphs might be different, but if you see the quantity of references, for example, 36 references to the United Nations in the Russian doctrinal documents, it approximately corresponds to the level in which European Union refers to United Nations and is visibly higher than the American reference to the same terminology. As for deterrence, the terminology is quite limitedly used by the Russian side, and as I noticed before, only in the pure sense of the nuclear deterrence within the nuclear complex of the Russian Federation. At the same time, as other permanent members of United Nations, Russia is not so often refers to the United Nations supported peacekeeping in conflicts. Yes, Russia does a lot of operations on the territory of the post-Soviet space, and Russia participates in military actions in Syria and other places, but they are not UN mandated, and this is why reference to UN mandated peacekeeping is on quite a low level. As for terrorism, that's interesting because this really represents the differences in American approach, European approach, and Russian approach. In Russian Federation, the reference to terrorism as a threat, as a risk, is more or less steady during the period from beginning of the 2000s and until now. In both military doctrine of Russia, which is red dot line, and the foreign policy concept of Russia, which is a blue line, the interest and attention to terrorism is kept on the, like, so to say, middle level. But if we look in the American application of the notions of terrorism, we see a very visible tendency. It was extremely high, 99 references in 2006, soon after the 9/11 events. Then it's getting lower and lower. It is like diluted by other risks and challenges, among which, by the way, that we see from other documents, non-proliferation or rather proliferation becomes considered a risk and threat, which is equal to terrorism by many parameters if you analyze the doctrinal documents. European Union, vice versa, had no interest toward terrorism in the early 2000s. Then, after 9/11 events, the first references to terrorism emerged. And then it is steady growing approximately to the level in which Russian doctrinal documents are working with this terminology. And finally, we placed on this one graph three visual representations of red line American approach to terrorism, the application of terminology and concept of terrorism, which is coming down with years, and Russian and European approaches more or less coincide. Growing interest, which now is at approximately the same level as the reference in American doctrinal documents. So, of course, we all understand the limitedness of this content analysis terminology. At the same time, it really shows some dynamics in the mentality of the decision makers. And we may say that really we need to work on our next editions of the doctrinal documents to make them more talking towards to each other, more coinciding in definitions. For example, there are no yet any statements whether Russia is considered an adversary or enemy in American documents, and there is no any statements that say the West or United States are considered as enemy or adversary in the Russian documents. But there is no as well the opposite statements. It is not stressed. It is not visibly presented. Probably now, when the work is going on the new edition of the military doctrine of Russia, we need clearly advice to our Ministry of Defense colleagues and our Foreign Ministry and Security Council colleagues to look how the issues, what are risks, who is the enemy, who is adversary, are formulated in these documents. And not an enemy statement should appear in both American doctrinal documents of next generation and Russian documents as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Professor Nikitin raised an important problem of doctrines, the approach to threats in the doctrines, national doctrines, in the official documents of Russia, of the United States, of the European Union. And what attracts special attention is the, so to say, the problem of approach to threats on the doctrinal level. I mean, what threats should comprise in terms of values, in terms of civilizational approach, and in terms of legal framework, especially in the context of the role of the United Nations, namely speaking, the problem of peacekeeping, the problem of terrorism. There are several aspects that should be discussed in this context, and I would like to invite participants of this session to ask questions, to pose questions to the panelists, and to actively participate in the discussion. So maybe you should raise your arms, please, Professor Dubinin.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Streltsov. I have a question and a statement. As to my question, it is to anyone in the panel. You see, the system of non-proliferation, as it was established historically, didn't prevent any country from acquiring nuclear weapons. Prior to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, we saw that France, for example, and China acquired nuclear weapons, and nobody could prevent those countries to get this lethal means of destruction for their own use. Later on, they have become the legitimate members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty as nuclear powers. Now we have at least 4, maybe more, at least 4 de facto nuclear states. So my question is, how the international community should treat these de facto nuclear states. We saw, for example, that the George W. Bush administration accepted Indian nuclear status. What we do with Israel, what we do with Pakistan, North Korea, whatever. So this is my question to any of the panelists who would be prepared to answer. And my statement, if I may, make it, because I see that we have a cyber questions in one of the following sessions, which I would not be able to attend due to my other obligations. But I personally believe that we have 2 spheres where the military application and the military competition will become very dangerous. This is the space and cyberspace. I mean outer space and cyberspace. So don't you think that it's time now to start thinking, at least thinking, about the possibilities of having some kind of negotiations on the demilitarization of outer space and rules of the game of non-militarization of the cyberspace? I read the article by Sergei Rogov in Foreign Affairs recently. He doesn't, the former director of the U.S.-Canada Institute of the Russian Academy of Science, he didn't touch on the question of this outer space and cyberspace. He spoke primarily about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, of course, is important. But don't you think that history teaches us, unless we start discussing matters now, later on we'll have to deal with the piling up numbers of the new instances of the militarization of these 2 spheres that I'm very much concerned of. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe some panelists, please. Professor Nikitin.
Starting from the last question, in the sphere of, so to say, regulation of military activities in space, there are 2 concepts which clash with each other. One concept is joint Russian-Chinese approach. Russia and China elaborated a draft of a treaty which would be legally binding and which would prohibit many types of activities, military activities in space, while US plus European Union elaborated a different document, Code of Conduct, which is absolutely non-binding and which is based upon principles of, so to say, ethics in space. And these 2 approaches clash with each other. In a sense, it reminds the situation with the Treaty on European Security, which Russia proposed in 2008, when Russia was insisting that the rules should be codified. They should be really the rules which are strictly written and voted for and then obliged and then implemented, and then sanctions should be following against those who are violating these rules. So strangely, while America is using sanctions in some other directions, here America is against any kind of sanctions because a lot of activities in space which might have the military consequences is already going on. And we know that China intercepted its own satellite with its own interceptor. So, yes, countries are experimenting with this. And yes, it is time to continue this work, but not start this work, but continue, because a lot already has been done. And one more observation regarding the arms control in cyberspace. Quite many conferences and dialogues already happened regarding the possibility to apply the principles which were elaborated in the classical and nuclear arms control, to apply them to the cyberspace. For example, the very notion of mutually assured destruction could be converted into the notion of mutually assured damage of one country to another country in the cyberspace. We know that countries are experimenting with devoting the task to destroy the material infrastructure of the other side by using cyber means. This task is given not to hackers. This task is given to the soldiers who are under Ministry of Defense of some countries. For example, Bundeswehr in Germany created a group of soldiers who are working in the cyberspace assault and counter-assault. In Russia, yes, we do have such military experiments. United States announced that they do have like state-subordinated groups of computer experts who are trained to destroy the infrastructure of the other side, to damage it. But then interesting component comes that cyber infrastructure has material parts. The fiber optics lines, which could be mechanically destroyed, or, as Americans say, we will not try to find in the cyberspace who sends the signal. We simply will send a cruise missile to destroy a group of soldiers who is sitting at the computers. We will not be responding in the cybersphere. We would be responding by kinetic warfare to the cyber attack. That's a very interesting approach that moves us towards the necessity to marriage between arms control on conventional and nuclear arms and this new cyberspace. And I leave to General Bushinsky the comments regarding the NPT.
Well, thank you. The first question about the possession of acquiring of nuclear weapons by France and China. I do not have a clear answer, but I presume that I suspect that it's not only France and China, UK also. I suspect that 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and at that time, United States transferred nuclear technologies to its allies, and Soviet Union transferred nuclear technology to its ally. So that was a natural state of affairs. As for the space and cyber, as for space, yes, Russia and China put forward the draft of the treaty in Geneva, forbidding the so-called weaponization or militarization of space, although it's not very accurate in my opinion, because space is used in for military purposes, for reconnaissance, for all kinds of that activities. The main concern of Russia is the deployment of strike weapons in space, not obligatory nuclear, because nuclear deployment is regulated by the old 1967 space treaty. But you see, the main obstacle is the U.S. position. You see, United States has several sacred cows in international activities, in military activities. The first one, of course, is the freedom of navigation at sea. The second one is missile defense, and the third one is space. So I don't think that the United States will change its position, especially the present administration. As for cyber, the main obstacle, in my opinion, is that there are too many non-state actors in that sphere, and how to regulate the activities of all kinds of hackers or non-state actors is extremely problematic. Although I am sure that some steps should be taken in that direction, but again, especially now, the main obstacle is the complete absence of trust, especially between Russia and the so-called collective West. Thank you.
Thank you. Diana?
And I'll just say something about the NPT. I think you have a sort of a dilemma. One is you do not want to send a message to countries that they can go ahead and violate the NPT and then get into the NPT. I mean, that will undermine the whole regime. On the other hand, I think people have argued that at least states like Israel, Pakistan, India have been tested already in crises and haven't used them, so they have behaved responsibly, and one can use this regime to bring some of the the de facto nuclear states to regulate their behavior. And if you're looking to prevent people using them and increase transparency, there's an argument for doing that. So I think one needs to figure out a way of associating them in a way that actually doesn't undermine the incentive structure.
Thank you. That I would like to add the only thing that, of course, the question raised by Professor Nikitin has very deep meaning in terms that whether so-called failed states or rogue states could use nuclear weapons as a sort of leveraging policy, a leveraging strategy in terms of preventing some sort of regime change or some external expansion, external pressure. And the problem that was raised is whether what are the standards for admitting for certain so to say admittance, for certain recognition of legal grounds for possessing nuclear weapons on the part of so-called great powers, on the part of the international community. And what we see is the existence of double standards towards this problem, because we see that on the one part the United States recognized the right of India to possess nuclear potential, meaning that India is, as well as Israel, as well as Pakistan, are reliable partners. But on the other hand, there is the problem of absence of complete trust towards North Korea, and now the problem of Iran is also the problem of trust. And one of the things is that the difference of approaches, how should we rely on such approach of trust, the problem of trust, and who will be the judge, who will decide whether a certain state should be trusted? Should it be some sort of international agreement on that, or should we rely on the decision of political leaders of certain states? So maybe there are some other points, some other opinions from the audience. Yes, please, Professor Vilikjanin.
Thank you. Thank you, all speakers. Thank you very much for your presentations. The law profession is very particular about terms. So my question is to Professor Chigas and to Professor Nikitin about the terms which you used. First, about the term doctrinal documents. Actually, the term doctrine is used in the Charter of the United Nations, in the French text of the Charter and in the Russian text of the Charter, in quite a different sense. So my question is to you, what is the difference between doctrinal document and document? My second question is to you, Diana. You mentioned the two terms, mistrust and distrust. My question is, the legal consequences of distrust and mistrust, are they the same? If not, what are the differences? Thank you.
Professor.
Lawyers always ask about form, not about content. So, in fact, by doctrinal documents, normally we political scientists, we mean the documents which are either voted for by legislative power or adopted by executive power, which means they are not scientific concepts. They are not just ordinary piece of paper. They are a rule or regulation for political action. And exactly in this sense, the strategic concept of NATO is used, the military doctrine of Russian Federation, foreign policy concepts. We know how they are coordinated. They are coordinated through, for example, here in Russia, through Security Council of Russia, when, say, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Emergencies is providing proposals, then they're mixed, in a draft of text created, sent to different ministries again. So it really represents the mentality of the group of ministries, of forceful ministries, and in this respect, we may find another terminology. For example, the key regulating documents for foreign and defense policy. If you object against the term doctrinal, then the regulating ruling documents. But anyway, we were trying to work in this project with the documents which really are behind which the state stays. And these are not just scientific books. These are not texts prepared by one person. These are texts which represent mentality of the legislative and executive power of this or of that state. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So, Diana, please.
As a lawyer, I do appreciate your question. I don't think I'm not sure that there are legal consequences, but I think what we do know about trust, it's not that you have trust or don't have trust, is that the circumstances matter, and then they can lead to different possibilities for agreement and cooperation. And so in that sense, mistrust, there's a historical circumstance, say I don't trust the other to abide by their agreement, or that we have the same interests, that we're sort of on the same page. I think in this case, and what I referred to with North Korea and the U.S., I think both actually felt betrayed by the other. And in that sense of distrust after betrayal, it becomes much more difficult to come back together. So the mistrust deepens to an extent of both wanting revenge sometimes, but making really that bridging the differences much greater. So I think one needs to think about trust in a more nuanced way, and both how to build it, because the same tactics and the same strategies may not work once there's been a betrayal than when there hasn't been. And so in that sense, it may have consequences on the sort of form of agreement.
Thank you. Maybe some other questions? Please.
Thank you very much. It's not really a question, but I think more of an observation. I think today's presentations, particularly by our Russian colleagues, and particularly by General Brzezinski, underscore the difficulty in finding common ground between our two countries. There's much that I disagree with in his presentation. I'd single out the INF Treaty, where the United States considers itself to be in compliance with the treaty, is committed to the treaty, and in fact finds Russia to be in violation of the treaty, specifically through the development of an intermediate-range cruise missile. So I think I do agree on one point that General Brzezinski made, and that, leaving aside the lawyer's question about mistrust and distrust, is that there is a profound lack of trust between our two countries, unfortunately, and that is something that we need to address. And I hope that the conference continues to work at that, but I'm not sure that this was a particularly auspicious start to it. Thank you very much.
Please.
Thank you. Well, about INF Treaty, since I was engaged in that treaty when I worked in the MOD, I was responsible for the implementation of that treaty. I must say that, you see, when United States claims that it was in full compliance all the way, I don't think so. Russia started to express its concerns about the U.S. non-compliance with the INF Treaty, if I'm not mistaken, in the year 2000. 18 years ago. First, it was Gera missiles used by the United States as targets for testing its anti-missile defense, which actually a mid-range missile. Well, the first was they just took off one stage from the Minutemen to ICBMs and made it actually a mid-range missile. Second was attack drones. Of course, that was, let's say, letter of the treaty, not the spirit, because in 1887 there were no attack drones, but the definition of the cruise missile fully complies with the attack drone. And third, which the first two, of course, it's tactical and could have been settled through the Joint Commission. Unfortunately, the United States refused to settle those two issues technically. But the third one, MK-41 launchers, Aegis Ashore, in my opinion, as a military man, I do not understand why MK-41 launcher on board a warship can launch cruise missile, Tomahawk cruise missile, but when it's placed ashore, it cannot. Well, the first argument of the United States was that it's different software. But you see, software, it reminds me of the famous decision of President Yeltsin and President Clinton to zero targeting of ICBMs. So what's zero targeting? You take the disk off the drive and put it in your pocket. Zero targeting. When the need comes, you take it off your pocket and put it into the drive. It will take, I don't know, seconds, minutes, but not hours. And again, the targets are there. So then the United States produced the second argument. Some cables were not there. And where we asked, where are the cables? The our U.S. colleagues said it's somewhere at a distance. Okay, how long will it take to take the cables again to the launcher? So that's, in my opinion, the violation. As for Russian violation, the so-called testing of mid-range cruise missile, as far as I know, or at least I spoke a lot with my colleagues in MOD, United States did not produce real, as you call it, hard evidence. Telemetry, well, real images. Just, well, I suspect where you, on what your conviction is based. But you see, you've got to produce something real, which some evidence to the Russian violation. So, but I think that again, all these issues could be settled easily if the political will is there. Just sit and agree either to amend the treaty or to organize some exchange visits to MK-41 launchers in Romania and to our fire range in Kapustin Yar to examine the so-called Russia long-range cruise missile. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions, please? And then.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to engage. My name is Daria Svistanova. I'm a first-year master student, Faculty of International Relations, Russian Foreign Policy Program. So my question, if I may, goes to Diana, and it concerns Iran. So the United States under Trump regards Iran as a highly non-complying rogue state. So the strategy, as you said, is take it or leave it, to withdraw from as many things and deals as possible. But how is that compatible with the real United States interests, given that it only further pits Iran against the West and the United States in particular, and creates this atmosphere of mistrust or distrust, call it as you want. So my question is, how is that compatible with real interests of the United States rather than just the style of Trump foreign policy? Thank you.
Yeah, I think they're sort of figuring out what the real interest of the United States is still in debate. And there's a lot of debate in the United States about this particular move of the Trump administration, and both what the consequences will be. So my sense is there's disagreement about what the consequences of withdrawal and pressure will be, and I think Trump, in his style, sort of New York real estate style, actually believes that this will work. And there are many people who believe that it's not going to work, and it will produce exactly what you say it will. I happen to be one of them. And agree with that. But I think there's genuine discussion about whether that is, and I think he genuinely believes that. But then the other question is, I think there is some disagreement about what's the priority to address. And there are a number of people who say Iran's behavior in Syria, in Yemen, in the region is more important to address, and Obama deliberately left that out. And I think they're worried that it's not going to get addressed out of this, and that Iran is getting benefits without actually addressing some of the other issues. So I think that's what's going on in the United States. So it's not so clear. There are a number of different interests. It's not so clear which interests are served and which aren't served. But I would agree with you on the policy on this kind of a coercive policy or strategy, or and in that case, tactic, is that there's coercion without the engagement now, and I think that will be difficult then.
I would like to challenge the audience by making a controversial statement, because this is a scientific conference. We need not only to pronounce well-known statements, but say something interesting. And I suggest to consider whether we really can apply the terminology of arms control towards North Korea, because it really changes the rules of the game. As for now, American side is suggesting only one formulation, which is total denuclearization, which is not even on the horizon. It will not happen in foreseeable future. Then what? Then we need to work with North Korea on some different bases. And I know position of General Brzezinski, who normally says that North Korea has no weapons. It has devices which are not yet in the form of the actually well-organized armament. But still, until we recognize de facto that North Korea has something and start to work with it, for example, applying measures of verification, normal measures which are normally used by International Atomic Energy Agency, requesting information by the standards of transparency which are used by International Atomic Energy Agency, apply them towards North Korea. Until we will start to work with North Koreans as equal nuclear partner, we will not get any political result. Because as for now, we have like two requirements. We, international community, have two requirements to North Korea. The first requirement is, please denuclearize now. And then Koreans asking, and are you guaranteeing that after that you will not overthrow our regime? And then Washington says, no. After you denuclearize, we need regime to be out. We need to regime change, as we did in Libya, as we did in Iraq in 2003. And then North Koreans are sincerely asking, but we want guarantees of preservation of regime. Of course, American side is not ready to go as far as to say, yes, we guarantee the survival of regime, and then we can sit and negotiate small technical details about your nuclear program. But I'm afraid we, international community, we must do some compromise here. We must really change the scenario of negotiations with North Korea, and the starting point probably should be recognition that North Korea is a nuclear state. Thanks.
Thank you. You tried to, Professor Dresner, your question?
Yes, a comment and a question. First, to follow up on Diana's point on the previous question, I think the fundamental debate within the United States in terms of the nonproliferation issues on both Iran and North Korea, it's not just that there are other issues. It's really the debate about what comes first, trying to negotiate a non-proliferation agreement with the existing regime or believing that somehow maximum pressure either in Iran or in North Korea will lead to regime change. And so this is obviously a problematic, these leads to fundamentally different strategies, and there's fundamentally different disagreements within the United States on that approach. But this actually gives rise to the question that I wanted to ask, which is, one of the premises of the entire nuclear nonproliferation regime, the NPT and the host of treaties associated with it, is this notion of credible commitment. The idea that countries have committed to complying with the agreement, and in return for giving up nuclear weapons, they will be able to get access to nuclear energy. In return, other countries will abide by various elements of the agreement. And the simple fact is that over the last 15 years, you've had 3 significant reversals of course with respect to this regime. The U.S. withdrawal from the ABM Treaty in 2002, North Korea's withdrawal from the NPT Treaty in the mid-2000s, and then the U.S. exit from the JCPOA. And so this shift to more transactional diplomacy that many of you are talking about, I guess my question is, even in an optimistic scenario where a deal is signed with a country considering nonproliferation, what is the likelihood that that deal will persist, given the tendency increasingly over time of even great powers to decide they're going to exit agreements?
Thank you. Maybe Diana will try to answer.
I think that's the obstacle to getting the agreement in the first place, because people are fearing that because there's a history of that happening, and it's real. I think the dilemma is that the non-proliferation issues are so tied with some of the other issues that it kind of makes sense to deal with things comprehensively, but the other issues are clearly not ripe to be dealt with, so you get no agreement. And I think that's the dilemma, is can you... And clearly the kind of transactional strategy we've had so far of incremental has not led to the kind of development of trust that would then be needed to resolve the other issues. And one question is, are there ways of sort of redesigning the process? And I would agree, I think reframing the issues that are getting negotiated will have to happen because it creates more confrontation and creates conditions for violations where then you enter into the same debates. But one question is, can you create an incremental piece that will then create some step-by-step confidence? And it's not easy because it in fact doesn't happen very often in a lot of different situations. So I think that's the real dilemma.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Please, Professor Zwigelska.
Well, thank you very much, but I just wanted to follow up with the Iran issue, since I'm a specialist in the Middle East, and it's really very important for all countries of the region. So the main trouble with the withdrawal is that it means that no one is going to respect the agreements signed by the predecessors. And really, this is of great concern even to Israel, which was very happy about this withdrawal because they also thought it was far from perfect, though there is nothing perfect in this world. But still, they reminded about Muslim Brothers' position, that even Muslim Brothers, when they came to power in Egypt for a short period of time, they didn't dare even to think about a withdrawal from the Camp David agreements and from the peace agreement with Egypt. So the question is, what is your reading of the situation from the legal point of view? Thank you.
So maybe somebody will try to answer, no? Or maybe it's a rhetorical question that has no answer, ultimately.
I do think that the question is, I don't feel that this is a question towards Moscow. It's rather a question towards Washington. But if Washington kept silent, then Moscow speaks. You see, the bad peace is better than good war, there is such a saying, which means the presence of any legal ground for any relations with any country is better than the absence of the legal ground, by definition. The question in what degree the signed agreements would be followed by the next administration could be reversed to Moscow as well, because, for example, how Russia treats the Budapest Memorandum signed after the START treaty after collapse of the Soviet Union is approximately the same interpretation, that there are agreements which are signed in different political conditions by different political forces, and history changes the context, and then we need to change the approach. But still, Moscow doesn't go as far as to refuse from the signatures which are placed under the treaties. And from this point of view, really the presence of some agreement between US and Iran was a kind of international guarantee for many countries. It's perceived as a very serious problem created by current administration, not only in Iranian dimension. It is presented as a problem which really raises an issue of possibility to rationally negotiate with Americans and to have stable results which are respected for decades.
And I just add, I don't think the issue is a legal issue. I think the issue is a confidence issue and a trust issue and a reliability issue. And so I think bringing it into the legal realm is not going to address the issue, which I agree is a very serious issue that you addressed, is how are you going to know that these, whatever commitments are made now, are going to stay into the future. And that is a key sort of fundamental component of any kind of trust building. Joel may have some more comments on this, as the more practicing lawyer.
Professor Tretchman.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that the JCPOA is, of course, different from formal treaties. It wasn't signed. It wasn't intended to be a formal legal obligation. And if anyone observed the process of approval in the United States, one would understand that it was a very soft commitment by the United States that was subject to reversal in later administration. So I think we have to distinguish different forms of undertaking, different levels of formality, and recognize that when we accept in an international negotiation something that is soft and not intended or in the form of a binding agreement, we might not be able to rely on it.
Well, my question to the legal experts. Well, you see, of course, there is difference between legally binding and politically binding agreements. And GCPOA, in my opinion, has some unique position because it was endorsed by the UN Security Council resolution. So, is it legally binding or politically binding? Of course, he did not, United States did not ratify it, Russia did not ratify it, but it was endorsed by the UN Security Council resolution, which is normally is legally binding resolution for all members.
Endorsement of something that itself is a soft commitment, something that doesn't have formal obligations, doesn't create formal obligations. But you voted for that resolution.
So, dear colleagues, I think that you could continue your discussion during coffee break. So, our time is already over for this session. I would like to thank all participants of today's session and especially the panelists. They did their job very good. Thank you very much. By this I end this session. Thank you very much.